opening hymn this morning is number 530. For me has gotten clearer because people, in reaction to what people have told me I'm doing wrong, how can you be an artist and go to seminary? That was the first thing the vocational counselor said to me. How are you going to reconcile these two parts of yourself? And I didn't have an answer for that, but I think that I always knew that it was the same thing. And so it's other people that don't see it that way. And so I think I said about it, the vocation comes for me with that idea, the expansion of language, that we have such a limited idea of what language is, that it's either words that are written or words that you read, or even words that are spoken. But I know that I started defining it different for me in vocation when I started doing chaplaincy work and doing that midwifery to dying people, that I was seeing things as people were passing that didn't have words to describe them, but they were language. That language of birth that comes, that you see, and the language of death that's the same way, that it's almost tangible, but we don't have words. The mystery is always a step ahead of it. And so once I started doing that and have been doing art for a long time, they're not different, they're the same as each other. And so the parts where people told me that I needed to integrate or figure out how A attached to B to exist in the world didn't exist for me anymore. And I think the second part of vocational strength came when I first went to live in Mexico and I didn't physically speak Spanish.
When was that?
In 1993. Or at the start of 1989 when I went, but when I moved there, it took me a couple of years to graduate and move there. And the first 2 years, there's a sense of grounding and dropping into that place of how I had to have my needs met without words for the first several years at least.
When did you go to Mexico?
The first time I went was in 1989 with a group from my seminary for an immersion. And so I stayed for 2 weeks and knew that that's where my heart, when we flew into the city and I saw the expanse of Mexico City, yeah, and the colors from the jacarandas were blooming. It was in April and the houses were pink and yellow and turquoise. It had me there. And then we stayed with families for the time we were there, and I knew that I wanted to go back, but I had to come back and finish school. And so I had professors who supported me and sent me a letter that said, we know that what we started to do 30 years ago in outreach is not the same way as you're going to do it. We don't understand what you're doing, but we bless it.
Yeah.
And there was a one-way ticket for my graduation to go back to Mexico City. And so that was the start for me when I went back then, of not having a complete toolbox of the languages I need to communicate there, and not just words. It's like, how do you get around the city on a subway and keep yourself safe? How do you open doors? Because people tend to have courtyards and many keys and doors. And that first month there, I could never get all the doors open. That metaphor of being stuck, the key would be stuck in the door. And so there was a beauty of being a grown-up, being 39 years old, and watching my whole self learn like I was a toddler again. But I had this kind of if it was a whole orchestra in my brain, there's this one instrument that was watching it all. And I watched how I learned and how I experienced learning the words of language, how to act with my body so I fit into that big city, which is dance, really. That's just one piece of choreography. It would be things like, who do you trust when you're learning language? If I would have days when I would go, oh, my Spanish just sucked today. And sometimes it did if I was anxious or something was going on, and then other days, that was brilliant. And then when I could reconcile it, if it wasn't an internal thing with me, there were people who were being really critical and didn't want it for me. And so once I recognized that, I could appoint maybe one person to be my language coach. So I started seeing these non-verbal cues that come into language. And that's a place where it relates to music. All these arts are related, that music can't exist without rest notes. And so when I stopped and really listened to what people were doing around me, then I could see them in the rest note, or their actions that weren't verbal. If they were encouraging or discouraging, it wasn't always with words. And so that was a cue to me of relating it all. And the vocation of caring for people, that part for me, I don't consider myself a caretaker in this realm that I exist in. It's not that's not the goal of all this, is to take care of people.
Thank you. Keep going with that. That's pretty interesting.
It's a place, in a way, I deeply care and take care of people, but where does it go? Because
go from
that same place where I can go into my mind, where I'm connected to people, it's from the deepest rooted place that I am. It's not separate. It's not something you do for a living.
Yeah.
If you're a nurse and do hands-on caretaking, you do that for a living, or if you're a doctor, or if you're a social worker. But for me, my connection with what's divine is clear, and there's nothing. It's pure channel. So I'm connected to what's divine usually, and so when I'm with other people, I'm being myself. And it's just that I'm in a place where I'm being myself and they're being themselves. And so the caretaking, I don't have a result except for to connect with them with some compassion. That's the outcome I would want, for the connection of compassion. And I don't need any more outcome to fix them, heal them, go beyond that. And I go home at the end of the day. And so the hardships in my life are to be lighthearted sometimes, which I am. I think I have a wicked sense of humor most of the time, or that gets me through. But to live in this place that's a little bit different than most people experience reality, to do normal things. I have to work harder at that. Going to the movies, or not social life, because I think I have an okay social life. I do it pretty well, but I think I swim in deeper waters most of the time than most people do. And so I spent maybe 3 or 4 years practicing and mastering the art of not small talk, but entryway. And that's about threshold in a way, that if you're walking someone through a threshold and you want to know them, you don't drag them through the threshold into a place where they don't want to go, or if they want to lead you into that place, then there's a joy in kind of dancing and slowing that down if you don't want to go there. And it's different than making boundaries. It's seeing what the threshold is of where people want to go and where you want to go with them.
But you've brought us here to the threshold. Let's let me hear you explore that for me. Take me into the
with
threshold.
Thresholds, I think the word in Spanish is better, the umbral, which probably comes from the Latin. And so for me, everything is a threshold, and I don't practice this all the time, but the practices of that I think other cultures do better than mine are. That, for example, when I enter in the physical doorway, that's coming through a threshold. It's really cold outside today, so you came from outside to inside. And so the etiquette just of the physical threshold that you crossed, I wanted to create space for you to come in where we embraced. You took off your coat. I offered you tea. That's a real, it's a trivial one in a way, but it's deep.
It's very,
because it's that acknowledgement that every post, what are they, posts and lintels? Every time you go through one of those, you leave something behind, and something of you dies, and then you walk through it, and when you enter in, all of you goes into that new place, but you're in a new place.
Big space, big world.
For me, I look at it because probably the English word umbrella comes from that Latin root. I've thought of that before. You know how it has a center and then it expands out like that, and so that's where, when I saw that was the word for it. And I think I wrote a poem that was in Abriendo Camino that uses the word umbral, because I looked up that word. I didn't know it at that time. So I've thought about that word. And so then the place where I understand my own inner world of thresholds comes about for me more with embodied reality when I dance or move, which is one of the things that I do. That there's these places that there's these real thin lines of where your physical body is working in the world, but then where the spiritual touches it. And if you're aware of that contact in yourself, being aware of the brightness of being around people when your solar plexus lights up, or that's a practice that I learned through dance more. I danced a lot since I've come to the Yakima Valley.
I know you have.
And then it transforms itself back into my art in this real physical way. Because in art, the threshold for me is always to start with color. Or usually I don't have a finished idea of what I'm going to be doing. And it's an intuitive thing where I'm going to start when I paint. It'll just be that day I'll pick up a color or a form. Blessing the second Sunday of Advent for my colleague Jan Richardson in her new book, Circle of Grace. Blessing when the world is ending. Look, the world is always ending somewhere. Somewhere the sun has come crashing down. Somewhere it has gone completely dark. Somewhere it has ended with a gun, the knife, the fist. Somewhere it has ended with the slammed door and shattered hope. Somewhere it has ended with the utter quiet that follows the news from the phone, the television, the hospital room. Somewhere it has ended with a tenderness that will break your heart. But listen, this blessing means to be anything but morose. It has not come to cause despair. It is here simply because there is nothing a blessing is better suited for than an ending. Nothing that cries out for more for a blessing than a world that is falling apart. This blessing will not fix you, will not mend you, will not give you false comfort. It will not talk to you about one door opening while the other closes. It will simply set itself beside you among the shards and gently turn your face toward the direction for which the light will come, gathering itself about you as the world begins again. So I had this piece of blue glass that I don't remember where it even came from, but I wanted to, this piece I had done in black, and so I wanted to work with the blue, more of that idea of night sky. And so it may, today, usually when I start, I'll start gluing down pretty quickly to make a commitment to the piece. And so I'll work to that point probably today, but I don't know where it's going to go yet. And then I make these crosses for sale. And so I have some orders now. I don't do massive orders of them because I think about the person who's bought them when I'm making it. And so usually I will work doing counterpoint just because I need to get these done, and it takes my mind off what I'm doing, or it doesn't put my mind into what I'm doing here. So that's what I'm going to be doing today.
So you're working on both of those?
Yeah. And so the glass, when I started cutting it, this glass has its own language. It probably wants to be liquid more than it wants to be solid. And so when you cut it, use a cutter. And you don't have to try very hard, it wants to break. And I really like that about it. I use glass more than I do tiles in mosaic at this point, because it's so iridescent. I just really like the quality of it as a material. And you can cut it really little or big. This glass is kind of thick and it's got striations in it, so it's a little bit harder to cut. It'll be a little bit more brittle. This black glass was really like cutting on an ice rink. It cut really easily.
When did you start working with glass? That's pretty recent.
It's new. About 5 or 6 years ago, I went up to the Bilingual Guild and was puttering around in the glass studio, and I don't really like working with lead or doing stained glass. And so I started working with these broken bits of glass, and I haven't looked back with that. I still paint a lot, and I did a watercolor class online this summer that was super fun. Sort of reminds me, when it starts to form, of other languages that have characters instead of alphabets. And so that's just one way the form starts to grow. So this really started with the idea of the blue glass, and I really love these mirror bits, and I had a lot of tiles left from the last piece. And then this really beautiful piece of yellow glass. So someone sent me these little milagros, these little Mexican milagros on a bracelet, and they don't quite work for mosaics. You have to glue them onto something else, but they're really fun. So my friend that the cross is for really likes animals. This is a little pig. Gluing them onto the glass, and then I'll glue the glass onto the wood.
Are you doing more visual art and less writing?
Actually, no, because
Okay.
I write every day. I use Facebook, which isn't probably the best vehicle for it, but the first thing I do is wake up and write 100 words. And so I'm doing a lot of poetry. I think those things that I post on Facebook are poetry.
Yeah, I
And
agree
so
with
they
that.
have nowhere else to go right now except for there. And I try to like do blog them, but it constipates them sort of. Just somehow that vehicle of waking up, and it's sort of I wake up usually really early, like at 5 in the morning, and it'll be the first, it's the threshold, it's the exit from the dream and then into that world. It's like I want to get that down, and it's right there. It's usually just right there. And so that's been really good. And I've had to write some important things for work this year, in the last couple of years, to get back in, because I left the roster of the church, and so I had to write an essay to get back in. And that took a lot of time. It took me a month to consider that. And then I just got into a spiritual director's program at Gonzaga, and I had to write an essay to get into that.
This is new?
Yeah, I'll start that in January.
Hmm.
And so it's maybe, I haven't written like that in a while, where I really had to think about presenting myself, or that the right written word was my presentation, or what do you think about this? Answer this question. And so on the one that I did from the church, it was the first time I started being able to articulate hospice stuff, that I wrote about the gift of the church as I see it today. And this is a spiritual word, all connects, that I would get called to these places in pediatric chaplaincy where many of the folks are that we serve in the Yakima Valley have come here from Mexico and land on a place where they're at maybe second generation here. Their parents are here and speak Spanish and they speak English, and now they've had kids, and so their traditions are changing. And there was a story about this little boy who had passed away, a baby, and I had been with the family from the start of it to the end, and going to the house, and they were pretty clear. I believe we baptized the baby, but they didn't want a priest or any ritual in the house when the baby died, except for when the baby died, then the parents really wanted it, and everybody wanted the rosary in Spanish. And no one could remember where it was. And here we are in this bedroom, and the little baby's in a basket in the bed. It passed away, being cuddled by his family members. And they all started scrambling just to get one rosary. And they found it in someone's underwear drawer. In the end, that's where it was, at the bottom of the chest or drawers. And they brought it out and handed it to me, and I was to do the rosary at that point. So I had been to deaths in Mexico where they did the rosary, and I've done it at funerals, and I know it can be, I didn't know how to do it or contextualize to do it, and I realized at that point, you're it. You're the one that they're asking to do, and you're going to do this somehow. And it's really poignant because around the room in that morning, there was maybe 30 people in the room by then, that there are family members who don't speak Spanish anymore. There are family members who are not Christians and don't know how to pray that way, but yet everybody wanted that rosary, that real traditional place, and so we did it. And so that was the care of what is a church in terms of not the building anymore. It's not the building anymore. It's those moments where you can jump out of the building and be in the place to serve people right where they are.
You're a Lutheran pastor.
And so?
And you're practicing the rosary. You're going to Gonzaga. It's you've thrown out the boundaries.
I don't think there ever were my boundaries to do hospice work, because the way I practice and pray, that those whose boundaries are those? Whose boundaries are it that this isn't practicing the gospel? People tried to tell me, how are you going to contextualize this? Where are you going to make this integrated? But they had disintegrated it by putting all the things that are beautiful in a box and putting it over here and going, nope, this box is not what we do as theologians. This box doesn't count. And so I am a Lutheran. I know where my roots are and who I am within the context of my tradition. And yet the gospel is so much broader than that. It breaks the rules. That family broke the rule. They didn't have a priest come in. There's a dead baby laying in a basket. What are you going to do? I'm the one. I'm the priest that was there in that moment to comfort that family. There are no rules in that. The gospel breaks the rules. This is the gospel. It breaks the rules. That's the point of all this.
Era el año 15 del gobierno de emperador Tiberio, y Poncio Pilato era gobernador de Judea. Herodes gobernaba en Galilea, su hermano Filipo gobernaba en Etruria y Tracontide, y Lisancia gobernaba en Abilene. Anás y Caifás eran los sumos sacerdotes. Por aquel tiempo, Dios habló en el desierto a Juan, el hijo de Zacarías. Y Juan pasó por todos los lugares junto al río Jordán, diciendo a la gente que ellos debían volverse a Dios y ser bautizados para que Dios les perdonara sus pecados. There's a movement in theology that by the time I came around, people were saying it was a dead movement. It had already come and gone and seen its last heyday. And it's called liberation theology. And the idea of liberation theology grew up in Latin America during especially the 1960s, when there were many governments in Latin American countries that did not allow people to assemble. So you could go to church to Mass, but if you had Bible study like we do on Wednesday nights, we could be arrested at Kathy and Rob's house for being subversive. The gospel became that subversive because people were reading it to be able to act. And the people in San Pedro Martir, to get their needs met and their human needs met, of basic sanitation and water and food for the children, education and health, formed together in base Christian communities within their church parish. And what they would do is gather in each other's houses, and they would first read the Bible. Everything they did was grounded in Scripture. Some of them did not know how to read, and they would read the Bible to each other. And they would make stories out of what they read, and they would share the stories so it jumped off the pages of the Bible to come into their lives and be alive. The Word of God, the Logos of Christ that comes alive. So first they read the Bible. Then secondly, they pray. They would pray with all their hearts and minds, sometimes with words, sometimes without words. And they would not pray to God for specific outcomes. They did not go to God with a big wish list of desires. They went to their God and our God with open hearts and minds to listen to the Word of God and how it acted through them.